there's a level of appreciation and respect for where that animal came from. And in the same feeling of, excitement and all the hard work that it took to get there, I don't know what the right word is. I think it's a respect, but it's not a sadness, but you're recognizing the fact that that animal, it was processed to fuel you, right, and your family. And I think that level of respect has kind of been lost through these like large industrial type farming.
Greg, what's up, brother? Thanks for joining me on the podcast. Looking forward to this conversation today.
Yeah, same here. Thanks a lot for having me on. We're really excited to be here.
Good. Yeah, with 98% of the population, I think it is, that eats meat, I think it's important we discuss where we source our meat from. I got into hunting about 8 years or so ago, but there's a lot of people who are eating less than quality meat, to put it nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I grew up hunting. That's kind of what started me down the meat path myself. And, it was funny when we actually started our business, Little Belt Cattle Company, we were joking in the beginning, but we were saying, for anybody that has tag soup but still wants to fill a Montana tag, we can fill your freezer for you.
There you go. I like that. I actually got introduced to even just cattle, I guess, in general, because my ex-in-laws had some property and they would buy either a cow or 2 cows per year. And then my ex-wife and I would go in on it, and we'd split the cost of feed and split the cost of having it butchered. And so we'd have half a cow each year that we could feed the family from. And I loved that model. But I think the problem then was, unless you had property, unless you had the space and you had the capacity to buy a cow or two, it just wasn't practical. Running down to Walmart or wherever people get their meat from was way more practical, although not as great for them and obviously the economy as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but since you guys have done that, right, in the same way, I feel like with hunting, when you have a connection back to that food, whatever it is, whether it's, an elk or a deer that you shot or beef you produced, or even knowing the producer that produced that product, I think that connection back to our food is something that's just super important, something that a lot of people are looking for. And a big thing right now in the beef industry as a whole is knowing who and where your food comes from, and really truly knowing where that producer is, because there's so much beef now in particular that's sourced from, whether it's imported from overseas, with nothing wrong with that, right? But you have no idea, how that animal is processed, how it was raised, and there's really like no connection. And a big thing for us when we started this business was we wanted to feel the same way, that if you share, an elk tenderloin with a friend, that you knew where it came from, you knew the hard work that went into it. If that person ate half of it and scraped the rest in the trash, I mean, you'd be offended, and they probably wouldn't do that to begin with.
Right.
Knowing just the level of disrespect that would kind of show, not only to the producer of that animal, but also to the animal itself. And that's what we really wanted to build with our business was, kind of this connection back to who and where your food comes from, and really lean into this kind of, what does it take for local producers to be able to compete on a larger scale? And what does the marketplace look like for that? And, what we found is there's a lot of people that's really important to them, in knowing, and it's important to me, knowing what type of food that I'm feeding my family, that I'm eating. Anybody that's had the good fortune of working with, a nutritionist or human performance folks, the first thing they tell you is it's not just your fitness program, but it's your diet as well. And, when you start to look at, all of those things combined, for folks with like real active lifestyles, it just becomes super important. And again, I think a big part of that is feeling good about the food that you're buying and eating and feeding your family. Is just something that's really important to consumers today.
Well, I also think there's a level of humility that comes with it when you know what's happening with the entire supplier, the chain of where your food comes from. Because, you have a lot of vegans and vegetarians who have an issue with the way animals are treated, for example. And I would actually agree with that. When you have these huge factories that, mistreat and abuse these animals, it's actually not I don't think a real moral way to source our food. It has to happen. We have such a large population that I see that there's a need for it. But when you are familiar with the entire process, there's a level of humility towards that animal. You know, I remember, for example, the very first time I shot a large game, it was a white-tailed deer in Texas. And I walked up onto that deer and I thought, man, like I was excited because I completed my objective, which was to successfully harvest a deer for me and my family. But at the same time, I was a lot humble about it. I was like, oh, that's a beautiful animal. And I just took its life. And there was a lot more respect towards that animal than any other hamburger or steak that I'd ever had in my entire life. And I think that's what people need to realize, in addition to other things, is that, and maybe you're meaning something different when you say connection, but that level of humility and connectedness to our role in nature is crucial for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the connective part that I want more people to be able to recognize that feeling is the same feeling when you open your freezer for that deer. There's a level of appreciation and respect for where that animal came from. And in the same feeling of, excitement and all the hard work that it took to get there. I don't know what the right word is. I think it's a respect, but it's not a sadness, but you're recognizing the fact that that animal, that it was processed to fuel you, right, and your family. And I think that level of respect has kind of been lost through these like large industrial type farming things. And again, I'm not here to say we do it, this is what we do, right? But all of our staff goes through low stress stock handling. They've all been through programs that, basically really highlight and showcase and certify the humane treatment and care of those animals throughout. And fundamentally, our job in our business is to care for those animals to the highest level possible. And so at the end of that cycle, when those cattle go to the processor, there is a feeling similar to what you just described on our end as producers. And I think for us, the more that we're out there talking about what that looks like, talking about the real people that are involved and how much skill and time and effort goes into the quality and care of those animals, it builds more of that connection or more of that respect for where that comes from when people actually see and can kind of get more insight into that. Because I think a big thing in the US food system is that, because of the convenience of it, a lot of us have just, when we see a steak at the grocery store, at Walmart, we don't necessarily think about where that came from. We just have this feeling of like, oh, that's there and should always be there. And, for us, when COVID started to kind of show some of the early, just the cracks in the US food system as a whole, I think people started to kind of see that complacency for the first time, in that there isn't this guarantee that that's always going to be there, and there's people behind producing that, and there's quality and care that goes into doing that. And I think there is very much this drive now from a customer perspective to get better insight to the products that they're buying and consuming. And that's something that we've really focused on. And it's something that we've like truly is fundamental to our business. And that was where we started with it was, the quality and care that goes in these animals throughout that entire process. And being that so something that's a little bit different about our program and our beef program in particular is that we literally do 100% start to finish Montana beef within our own vertically integrated supply chain. So,
Right.
what that means is from the genetics to calves hitting the ground to yearlings, which would kind of be your like mid-sized cattle, to finishing cattle, to the processing and distribution. We do all of that within our business model. And I think the biggest thing and the biggest value that we can offer our customers is that we provide quality assurance through every one of those phases that typically in cattle, are different companies, different people doing those different phases. And so I could do a terrible job and sell it to you, and then you do a great job, and then you sell it to somebody else who does a terrible job. It's very hard to track that animal throughout that entire process. And what we wanted to do, we really wanted to, number one, we wanted to decrease kind of the footprint that those cattle have to travel. Montana's very much a cow-calf producing state, but typically those calves get sold in the fall. They go to the Midwest. They'll get grown there. They'll go to a feed yard in Kansas. They get bought and processed and distributed nationwide. But every time that ownership changes hands, you kind of lose, that history of that animal, of where it came from and how it was managed at that time. So what we really wanted to do was kind of put all that back together, so we knew exactly where those cattle were coming from, how they were treated from the beginning to the end. But it also allows us to adjust our program for quality and consistency over time.
I think that's the biggest thing, because with all due respect, I don't know how much consumers are interested in the history of the meat they're eating, like where it came from and where it was supplied from. I could be wrong. I think they're more interested in, I need to know that this is high quality beef or food that we're eating, because I mean, you can go to Walmart, for example, or any grocery store, and you can look at the meat and you can see, like, if you didn't knew nothing else about it, you can actually tell that is an inferior cut to something that you just pulled off the hind quarter of a deer you shot an hour earlier. I don't know exactly what it is, if it's the color of it, because you see, like, some of this meat, you walk into the store, it just looks like flabby and gross and flimsy and even brown a little bit. But then when you shoot an animal, or you have something that has a very direct path, like you're talking about here, like, you can see it, the richness of the color of the meat, the consistency of it, the texture of it, it's different. And I don't know all the data and science behind it, but you did say something interesting. You're talking about genetics. Like, have you noticed or done much research or dived into what meat, and I'm not talking about with what you guys do, but just in general, like what has happened to the quality of the food that we've been eating over, let's say, the last 100 years?
Yeah, and it depends on what food groups you're talking about. I will say in cattle, I think it's ultimately improved. When you start to look at just the genetics and the technology that kind of goes into that. So for and there's whole degrees behind all this stuff. So I'm certainly not an expert on all of it, but I'll tell you what my thoughts are on it from what we do. And we work with a lot of experts specifically in all these spaces. For cattle to really perform well as far as the meat side goes, they really need two things. They have to have the genetic capacity to reach, different quality points depending on what you're shooting for. For us, we're shooting for choice and prime. So we have to have cattle that have the genetic capacity to be able to make choice and prime beef. And they have to be on a food/nutrition feed program that gives them what they need on the feed nutrition side to basically pair with the genetics to get to that level.
Yeah, because just from if I can interject here, just from like a
Yeah.
layman's term, I spent some time with a friend of mine, Josh Smith, in Montana, actually, Frenchtown, Montana, with Montana Knife Company. And he was getting feed for some cattle. We drove into, it might have been Missoula or something. I can't remember where we went. We went to the feed store, and the guy was talking about it, and he was talking about how low the quality of feed has diminished. For the same cost, you're not getting nearly the same nutrients and density in the food that the cattle are eating that you were even 20 years ago. And obviously that's going to affect like you're saying, the genetic capacity and the ability for that cow to produce really high quality, like you said, what'd you say, choice and prime cuts for the consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. And Josh is a super good guy. I know Josh. Their knives are incredible. That is like pretty much
No
all
doubt.
we use. From my time in the Navy, where we had kind of access to great knives. I'm telling you, like, that Blackfoot 2.0 is like my everyday at the ranch, use it for everything. And, to their culinary knives, the knives Montana Knife Company makes are unbelievable. And Josh is such a great guy, and seeing what he's built here in Montana, kind of around the same time that we were building and growing, just another great company. But you're right. So, and what happens is, so for us, when we're feeding and finishing those cattle at our feed yard operation that we have, we're buying commodities on a regular basis. And what happens is you have different ingredients that basically make up the recipe that those cattle get fed to hit a performance goal. And we work with some of the best nutritionists. Our feed yard manager's been doing it for 50 years. And what I've really learned is you know, there's this mix between kind of art and science, um, that these folks have been doing this for a really long time. But ultimately, what you're, no different than any living thing, right? The quality of the feed or food that you're taking in has a major output on how you perform or how you do as a whole.
Of
And
course.
you know, I think some of that stuff, there's been a decrease just in the way that, where and how that feed is now produced. But I will say this, I still think that I think from a cattle perspective, I think there's actually probably been an increase in like the overall quality, size, care, over probably, the last, 20 to 30 years. And you're really seeing cattle that have the genetic capacity to hit those upper quality points, or rail performance, as we would call it, as it relates to beef, um, in a shorter amount of time. So you can feed them for X amount of days less, still hit that size and quality that we're looking for. But I do think, when you have these introductions now of like these fake meat products, and these different like meat alternatives, when you really start to look at some of those, and in that ground, that acreage has now kind of come out of what I would call more your high quality food or feed production, depending on what it's going into. I think that's having an impact because there's just less of it. It costs more to make it. You'll see those input costs go up, but those don't always correlate with beef prices. So as a producer and as a cattle feeder, for instance, in 2021, the cost to feed and produce cattle went up substantially based on the cost of that feed. And a lot of
Right.
that came down to just to how much was in the system.
Yeah, I mean, it's just essentially it's supply and demand, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. When you talk about the genetic quality, are you talking about through breeding alone? Or are you talking about through, you have GMOs, right? So those are genetically engineered. So that's not just breeding, but that's actually modifying them through injections, drug use, essentially. And so you're injecting that into these cattle, and then obviously we as humans are consuming that.
Yeah, I've never seen any of the GMO stuff as it relates on the live side, but there's a ton of GMO on the farming side. So let's say you're
Mm,
buying corn, that's going into feed. I don't know what the percentage is, but there's a high percentage now of GMO corn, right? That's being grown versus non-GMO. So just
got it.
within that supply. So if you're buying, for our feed yard, I mean, we're literally buying semi loads of corn, on a daily, weekly basis. And so the amount of corn that's out there that is GMO, non-GMO, it'd be interesting to look up like what the difference is now. But that shift towards GMO on the farming side
Not at the
as
ranching
it,
side.
yeah. And so for us, when I
Mm,
say genetics, what I'm really talking about is the live cattle side genetics, where if you look at, from a female side and a male side, your cows and your bulls, um, you know, probably the easiest way to look at it, if you said, I want to make NBA basketball player, right? I'm 5'7", 160 pounds. I probably wouldn't be a great sire group to make an NBA basketball player, right?
right.
And
Sure.
and but if you took on the female side somebody that was a fantastic basketball player, the right height, the right skill set, you paired them up on the sire side, the probability of their offspring hitting those performance goals is going to be pretty high. And you can do all that now through all these different numbers that looks at the genetic lines of your females, which the ranch typically owns all the females. And then what we do is we buy bulls,
Mm,
typically on an annual basis, that we'll have in the herd for a certain amount of time. And the genetics that those bulls combine with the females. And if you think about cattle, which it's kind of interesting, is there's a female side of the performance as well, and then there's the bull side, which typically you could buy bulls that their genetic capacity for very high quality, high performance beef, is one thing, but that potentially then could detract from like the female side. So you're always trying to pair that up to where you
mm,
have, females that have like what you would call maternal instincts, so their ability to produce calves, raise calves, and do that year over year. And then you have this bull performance side that, is going to be 50-50. But also when we look at buying bulls in particular, we're always kind of weighing this, what are the kind of the female qualities that are going into it, and what is the beef performance side that's going into it. And so that combination is what allows you to run a cow herd that is producing the type of cattle that are, number one, going to be able to, on the female side, go back into reproduction, and on the male side, go into the beef side of the house and perform very well. And over time, you can really kind of dial that in. And for us, when I say like we are 100% Montana, we literally buy bulls from Montana seed stock producers that, we're utilizing genetics that have been produced here in this state, and that's going back into our cow herd. So not only are we doing like start to finish from our cattle, but really truly our genetics are also coming out of Montana as well. And that's pretty fun because, even a lot of producers that have been doing it for 100 years typically may never see, how those cattle actually perform, as on the final stages of beef production. And so it's really interesting to kind of give some of that feedback back to those producers. And but it's really interesting. And when you start looking at all these genetics and things, you realize there's such a key component. Like I was saying, they've got to have the genetic capacity to get to that level of performance. Otherwise, it's like you can shine a shoe as long as you want, and it might not ever get there. And so you could feed them perfectly and they might not get there, or they could have great genetics and you don't feed them the right nutrition program and they might not get there. So it's this very much combination. And it's hard. It's really hard because you don't know, honestly, until they're hanging on the rail, how you're doing. And those decisions typically take like 24 months. Like if I buy bulls today, I won't see the outcome of that decision for 24 months.
2 years.
And yeah. And so in this day and age where like everybody's so used to like immediate responses, immediate feedback, there's a lot of patience that goes into it because it might look like it's working on the live side. And then you kill a semi-load and you get the performance data back and you go, oh, like that one didn't go so well. So why didn't it go so well? And then you go back through your whole process. And that's what we're able to do because we're tracking all of that stuff literally from the genetics all the way through.
I mean, it's really a 4-year process because if you have 2 years from the time you have that calf, for example, till the time it gets to butchering, you measure the performance, and let's say it's producing well or it's not, you make adjustments, but then you're another 2 years out before you see if the adjustments worked.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we started Little Belt Cattle Company in 2020, so we're a first generation working cattle ranch based business is what I like to tell people. And when we started that project, we put a couple places that were one of them was still in agriculture, two of them weren't. So we put those back into agriculture, and we knew we really wouldn't see a return at any capacity for close to 24 months because we got our cow herd started. Those cows had to have calves. We had to raise those calves to a certain time frame. And so it's super capital intensive as you're getting going just because
I'm sure
the return on that investment is pretty far down the road. And so you got to be really committed to kind of the runway length that it takes to get off the ground. And that was something that, just the timing of it. But like you said, from when you make a decision to when you see the results of that decision it's years. And you really have to there's so much work that goes into the organization of like, what was the decision at that time and tracking all that stuff so that you can go back through and not only identify what went poorly, but also what went well so that you can keep doing that.
But this is interesting because I just assumed, and I don't have any knowledge on this, but I just assumed that each producing ranch would have their cows and then their bulls all together. Are you saying that there's some ranches that just have bulls, for example, and then you as a mostly, I guess, female cattle ranch, I guess you'd say, do you then buy the breeding rights for a period of time for those bulls? Is that how it works?
Yeah, great question. And so again, this is all part of like I think this like kind of customer education because if you're not in ranching, and I didn't come from a ranching background, something I always had a lot of interest in when I got out of the Navy. I was kind of looking for what I was going to do next, and so these were all questions that I had, and I love kind of walking through it with people because it was just something I found fascinating. The more I learned about it, and if you don't come from it, there's not a lot of places out there to where that information is. So basically, you have typically, and I'm just going to call your kind of traditional ranch style operations. You would have what's called a seed stock producer or a registered producer. And what those folks do is they typically produce breeding class animals for the other side, which would be called a commercial operation. That's what we would be. So as a
Got it.
seed stock slash registered operation, you're literally tracking what female you bred with which male, what is their basically what does their family tree look like and which animal was produced by them, and then all of those animals have different performance traits that they track through genetics. And again, there's a female side and there's this male side. And so on these registered seed stock producers, you would have folks that all they do is produce animals that are going to go basically into their own herds and or other people's herds. So on the bull side, which is probably the easiest to look at. So, you can look at, we work with a number of great bull producers, Sitz Angus, the Vermilion Ranch, Stevenson Angus. Some of these folks have been around for 100 years doing this, and they have a track record of performance that's been traced that long. And so what they'll do is they'll produce these bulls. They'll down to, this is the family tree on both sides. This bull was produced by, these are the genetic performance traits that that bull has. And then they have a sale typically once or twice a year. And you go to that sale and you start buying bulls for your program based on those performance criteria that you're looking for. And everybody's are a little bit different, just depending on what kind of cows you're running. And then you buy those bulls and then they become yours and you
They're
typically
yours.
own them. Yep, exactly. And they become your, that it it does two things basically, right? You're introducing new genetics into your cow herd so that you don't have. So for us, then, as a commercial operation, we have a certain number of females, right, that produce calves each year. The male calves that we produce at branding time get castrated and become steers. So they will not go back into a breeding program because we don't want for our program, basically inbreeding or line breeding is what they would call
Right.
it.
Yeah.
And so what we do is all the males we produce literally go into our beef program, but all the females come back into our reproduction side. And every year you have cows that leave the program. And the way you keep your numbers stable is so if I have 10% of my herd leaves because they age out, there's a number of performance criteria that the females need to hit. They don't hit that, we would cull those out of the herd and we would replace them with new females. And then you can sell those females to other producers. There's a number of things that you can do with them. But the big takeaway there is you have these commercial operators that they don't track the genetics nearly as specifically as a registered or seed stock producer does. And typically that's because you're not selling your cattle as as breeding
Breeders.
stock
Yeah.
for exactly for other operations.
Right.
But your typical cow calf guy, if you think about it as a factory, the females are the factory. Every year they produce a certain number of calves. There's a certain number of bulls. There's a ratio that everybody's is slightly different. For us, we use one bull per 20 cows. So, you can easily do the math on however many cows you have. That's how many bulls you have. Those bulls get turned out at a very specific time. For us, it's July 15th. That sets those cows up to calve in April 15th, which would make us like a spring calving operation. A lot of that has to do with the environment, when grass grows in. And so there's all these timing things that happen that are really critical within the overall operation because, those cows basically have to produce a calf. They have to have enough time to basically, recover and nutritionally get into a place where then they're able to reproduce when those bulls get turned back out. So for us, we start calving April 15th. We typically go to June 15th and we turn our bulls out July 15th. So some of those cows only have about 30 days from having a calf to being able to be rebred. And
To
that would be
breed
a
again.
performance criteria that we look for where we need those cows to be able to get rebred. That's another kind of critical component to ranching as a whole is what does your conception rates look like? And you want those to be in the upper 90s typically. And then, how many of those cows that were pregnant, how many of those bring a calf in? Because that typically is your revenue driver, whether you're a calf operator, and then the next phase of operation would be called yearlings. So those same calves then could be bought by somebody else and grown to another size. And then typically
Mm.
they would get bought by, they'd call them like a heavy feeder. And so, you would buy them at 1,000 pounds and finish them to 1,500. And then they'd be sold typically in the standard program into kind of the big four that you hear about, where they would buy them as a fat cow. They would call that like fat cattle. And then those cattle would go into your processing.
Is there, so this is actually, I've got so many, I've taken notes here. This is so interesting to me. With the fat cattle, it almost seems like cheating the system a little bit because you have this 1,000-pound cow, for example. And from what I understand, I could be completely wrong. A lot of the times in this extra process of getting them from 1,000 to 1,500 pounds, they're just fed a bunch of shit just so they can extract a few more dollars when they sell because it's based on weight, not necessarily quality. Am I understanding that right?
Not really. I think
Okay.
there's a big misconception, and I think there's been a lot of like negative marketing campaigns against what we would consider to be grain fed. I'm sorry, like a grass fed, grain
Right.
finished. And that grain finish does a couple things. There's all these misconceptions that like cattle, it's not in their natural food system, which just isn't true. If you had a bunch of grass and you had, grain in whether that's corn, whether it's distiller's grain, et cetera,
Right.
and you had it out there, and there's ranches that do this, right? And you just had it out there in bins. They'll eat the grass and they'll also eat the grain, right? They have the capacity to, a ruminant has the ability to process that. And what that does is it puts weight on them, but that is actually where you get that like deep muscle marbling that you see in a grain finished product that you don't see in a grass finished product. And so
Mm.
it's not necessarily that they're feeding them a bunch of shit. It's 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 a different style of feeding where those cattle come off the pasture, they go into a feed yard, right? So they're not on these big open grass areas, but they're fed a very specific diet. But a good portion of that diet is still made up of it's still like grass, hay, alfalfa based diet with this addition of grain that allows them to put that fat on and really allows for that development of marbling. And the amount of time that they spend in the feed yard all goes back to like the size they came in and how they were fed leading up to that. So for us, we try to put our cattle in the feed yard for like the right amount of time to get them where they need to be finished consistently at a quality standard that we've set for our program. And so it's not that they're fed like a bunch of shit. They're actually fed like a more expensive diet, right? It's a very set diet, and that we would call it a ration. That ration changes as you can't just all of a sudden put like all this feed in front of them. There's a workup to
Oh,
that.
right.
And it's super specific, but that is how you get those cattle. A big portion of grading cattle as choice, prime, select, etc., is based on the marbling and the marbling in a specific rib that they look at. It's very hard for grass-fed, grass-finished cattle to get to that point without the addition of that grain. And the interesting thing about it, though, is there's been all these things that look at environmental impact, et cetera. So we use regenerative ranching practices at the ranch. We use rotational grazing. We basically have gone away from tilling. We've gone away from fertilizer. So we use the cattle to basically rotationally graze through the ranch to not only eat the grass, but to refertilize,
From
re,
the
you know,
manure, right?
exactly nutrients back into the soil. And those cattle follow throughout that entire deal, right? They then go into the feed yard for a very set amount of time. And yes, they're in like closer proximity. Yes, they're fed a specific diet that is grain based, but it actually gets them out of there and into processing quicker. So those cattle are actually like in the system shorter, which actually reduces their overall impact, like environmentally when
Sure.
compared to grass animals, because to get a grass animal to 12 to 1,300 pounds is pretty challenging. And I'm not an expert in grass fed, grass finished because we don't do it, but they will not get in the same time frame. There's no way to get them to what I would consider to be a finished weight to process. And so those cattle have to go, like those cattle, number one, are going to be in that system way longer. And then once you get beyond 30 months of age, there's a whole number of things that like physically start to happen, to those animals just as a whole. And is a disqualifier for some grading programs within the
Mm,
USDA. And so there's every program has its pros and cons, just like, kind of everything in life, right? I'm not saying grass fed, grass finished is bad by any means. There's absolutely a customer base to it. I think they've done a fantastic job of marketing that product in a way that resonates with certain people. There's benefits from that product and there's benefits from grass fed, grain finished. There's also a customer base that is extremely accustomed to a grass fed, grain finished product. So your
right.
restaurants, your high end, markets, there's very very few restaurants at certain scale that do a grass-fed grass product because the US customer expectation at those type of restaurants isn't for that product. And so the customer base that we focused on initially, which was local Bozeman, Big Sky, Montana markets and restaurants, competing with national level programs, are all grass-fed, grain finished. And the cattle that we were producing, on the genetic performance side as well, was more geared to that. But then what we did, which was I think a little bit different, was we looked at all these regenerative practices that a lot of the grass-fed, grass-finished guys were doing, and we're using that, for the first 20 months of those cattle's
Right.
lives, and then the last, 4 to 5 months they're going on feed to get that finished. That puts them into the program for the customer base that we're targeting.
It's interesting. I almost wonder now that you're saying this, like when you go to the store and you buy, a sirloin or a steak or something like that, where it will say grass fed. I don't know. I could be wrong. I don't think it says grass finished. I think it just says grass fed, which is a little misleading if they're grain finished. And I think they're
It's so
using that.
misleading.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have to question now for everybody, including myself, who's like, oh, grass fed's better, and you get this grass fed labeled meat is not actually 100% grass fed based on what I'm hearing you say.
So the marketing again, right, and all this stuff comes down to this like major component. So it's really
Yeah, this is
interesting. If you
wild.
do any research or Googling on the labeling laws in America, there's all these interesting things, right? Grass fed could be grass fed pellets in a feed yard, or it could be grass on open pasture.
Wild grass, yeah.
Exactly. So, like the parameters of what grass fed, grass finished means as it relates to labeling, unless there's specific requirements, and there is great programs out there, like Whole Foods has one. There's third party verified programs out there,
Mm,
right, that say like this ranch is doing this, and to put those labels on get them approved by the USDA, you have to be able to prove what you're claiming, right? To say grass fed, grass finished, you're not proving anything, right?
mm,
So that's not actually it it's not. People think it's something more than potentially that it is, right? and
absolutely.
and there's certain requirements, like you can't say that you're, you know like organic means one thing, but it means a very different thing than what a lot of people think it does. Grass fed means something very very different. Like we're grass fed, grain finished, right? There's a certain amount of days that they have to be on grass to be considered to be grass finished. But you could be feeding them alfalfa pellets, in a feed yard type setting, and they would call that grass fed, grass finished, which I don't think most people buying grass fed, grass finished have that
That's what they're
in
looking for.
in
No.
exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
and it's interesting too on the organic side. When I hear that, immediately what I think is this is a pasture fed animal that has not been introduced to a bunch of GMOs and hormones and these sorts of things. That's what I think as the average consumer.
Yep. It doesn't mean that. If you look up what organic means, so like
Interesting.
for us, our cattle are hormone free, or I'm sorry, they're no hormones ever, and they're antibiotic free, right? Both of those things have like a specific definition by the USDA to put that on your label, right? And there's party verification of that being accurate, right? If you just say organic, that means something completely different than that. But I think the assumption and through marketing is people start thinking like, oh, this is this, right? Or this is that. And it's just not. And so you can take, so here's a great one for you, right? And there's a local company that literally does this. They buy exported beef or just like boxed beef in the US. They
Okay.
bring it into Montana, but it comes in a box. They've never seen a live cow in any of the stuff that they do. They buy boxed beef. They bring it in from another company. They have no idea where it came from. They open it, cut it down into steaks, repackage it, and put a Montana made label on it.
Oh, yeah. See, I hate that stuff. Where does this
Yeah.
food, where is our import of beef primarily coming from?
A lot of it's from South America.
Okay.
And again, like, so here's an interesting thing. You look at a lot of these like big, and again, nothing against them, but you look at like Butcher Box, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Huge, amazing company that they built. 90% of their grass-fed, grass-finished product comes from Australia, South America, and it's imported because they can buy it imported a lot cheaper because there's not the same parameters on those producers as there is in the US. So they can buy it a lot cheaper,
Mm.
they can mark it up, and they can make a lot of money on it, right? But a lot of people don't realize that the cattle that are coming, out of that, especially in the grass-fed, grass-finished market, a very, very high percentage of those cattle in the US system right now are imported cattle. And there's all these local producers that are trying their best to make it work, or doing a really great job making 100% Montana beef. That's really hard to compete with these import products because they just aren't under the same parameters that we are, and they can just sell it into that system so much cheaper. And that's why we encourage people all the time, like, we just went to an online, like nationwide distribution with a partner, with two partners actually, and we're now able to do, like, if somebody orders from the website, it can get right to them, right? And I tell people all the time, like, a prerequisite for liking Little Belt Cattle Company doesn't mean that you have to dislike everybody else, right? If
Yeah.
you're buying from good local producers, that's helping the system as a whole, right? When you're buying from American producers, small producers, and you're buying locally, like, you are supporting a local economy and a local supply chain that has far broader impact than most people realize. Your local trucking, local farmers, right? Like, when we look at the impact that Little Bell Cattle Company has as a whole on the folks we hire, on the businesses that we work with, on the restaurants, the markets, etc., and all of the benefit that local supply chain hits. And the interesting part is it takes ranchers, it takes restaurateurs, it takes chefs, it takes customers to do that. But when you're supporting local agriculture and local production, whatever that means, that could be supporting me, or that could be supporting the guy down the street that raises a certain number of steers and sells them at the farmers market. You're truly supporting like this American system that we're seeing a ton of agriculture acres leave the system right now. We're seeing the average age of producers, both on in ag in general. And I might not be 100% on this, but the last one I read was 58. A lot of those people don't have a succession plan. You don't see a lot of new people coming into the industry like we did. You see acres leaving it that aren't being put back. You see demand going up, but supply going down. So how as a whole does that system maintain if we're not supporting local, producers. And there's so many people that are doing it now and that are doing it really well. Everybody and the way that we do that is through customers voting with their dollar and starting to
Mm-hmm.
say, where does this come from? I want to know what this label means. I want, some sort of level of verification and quality assurance and I think that's the biggest thing. There's programs out there. Certified Angus beef's an unbelievable program, and it's a label that says we've set standards for the beef that's going to get this label. And when you buy that product, you know that those
You
cattle
know.
met that qualification, right? It makes people feel better about what they're getting. We always highlight what our program looks like for the same type of reason. We want people to say, I know who and where that came from. I know I can pick up the phone, and if Greg answers, or anybody on our team answers, we can say to you, this is exactly what we do and how that beef is produced down, to every single level of it, right? Because that's like the obsession that we put into that part of the quality assurance. And that's something that you don't see on these large national programs that they've lost. So when you're just going to the grocery store and you see this label and you go oh, that must mean that I'm going to buy this product. There's really no way in a lot of those programs to actually verify what you're getting. And that's back to this connection point. That's part of the connection that we want people to know this is what you're getting and this is where it's coming from. And for us, we want people to feel good about the fact that we've, decreased the geographical footprint that those cattle travel. We buy local produce that goes into that feed. Those cattle never typically leave 90 miles, from where they started. They're, the way that they're cared for, the certifications that all of our employees get, the professionals that work in this industry. We're trying to highlight all of that stuff because all of that has impact on that final product.
Look, I want to talk a little bit about the vertical integration you were talking about, because I think there's a little bit more awareness of this, and I could be completely wrong, but primarily, if I understand correctly, you have 4 big processing facilities in the country. You have like Tyson Foods, JBL or JBS, I can't remember.
JBS.
JBS, yeah, and then there's a couple others I can't recall right offhand. But I think one of the understandings, whether it's accurate or not, is that these are owned by foreign countries, and I don't know if that's true or not. And so I'd like to hear about that. And then, are you using these processing facilities, or when you say vertical integration, are you saying that you have your own processing facility that bypasses that altogether?
Yeah, great question. And so anybody can go out there, right? And you can just do a quick Google search on these. So JBS is one of the largest producers, Brazilian owned company. And you can look up what that company looks like, right? And then, you had companies that started out as American companies and have grown into large corporations, right? There's a reason that consolidation happened, right? And that would be a whole separate podcast on over time, why did consolidation happen within the cattle industry and a number of under industries over time, right? So for us, we do not use one of the big 4 processing. You have to be at a certain size and scale to even be there. And typically the way those plants work is they're buying fat cattle in a national system that are going to those packing plants. They're slaughtering and then packing for certain programs for nationwide distribution, right? So those cattle are coming from all over the country to fill a certain number that goes through those plants. And all of those companies are very good at doing that. And they have a lot of buying power when you look at the amount of,
Oh, I'm sure.
and so for us, we started out at like a very small processing facility. What happened was, especially during COVID, where people started to see this bottleneck of beef not getting to the grocery store, like we talked about before, and like people hadn't seen before, the federal government put a lot of money out there, typically through grants, into starting these small to mid-sized processors. Montana's an interesting case. So all these processors started to pop up. But then one thing that processors need is a steady supply chain of cattle coming
Of
through
course.
there. right?
Right.
And so, like Montana, like I said before, is more of a cow calf producing state, and there's a number of reasons why. Typically, the corn belt, in the Midwest, is where a lot of cattle grow and get finished because there's a ton of corn.
That's
We don't have as
plenty
much
of,
corn in
yeah.
Montana. Yeah, and so there's a reason the system exists in the way that it does. So, with that being said, all these smaller plants started to pop up, and we worked at one of those plants for a while. They did a great job for us. We started out initially, we were processing a couple head at a time, like a half a horse trailer, and then we started to fill a horse trailer, and then two, and now we're doing full semi loads, multiple times a month.
And what would
And
that
so
be? A semi
we
load, roughly? What are we
yeah,
talking about?
35 to 40 head, depending on
Got
the
it.
number of axles in the truck. So that would be a semi
Got
load.
it.
It's either 53,000 pounds or 60,000 pounds, depending on the size of the truck that you're doing. And then typically, two semi loads would make like one semi container load of finished product, if that makes
Got it.
sense.
Yeah, sure.
Just to give people an idea, because you
Once you
have a
break it
live
down,
animal.
debone it, that sort of thing.
Yep. Just like an elk or a deer, right? Like you have it laying there as a full carcass. As you break that carcass down, bone, skin, organs, head, etc., come off of that overall, and then you get these yields that are like critical to the overall performance of your business within beef. Because then you
Sure.
go, this is how much I have to sell, and so we're constantly evaluating all of those things. Um, and so for us, we moved to what I would call a mid-sized packing plant. Um, it's a new facility. It focuses on, we would be what's called like a custom kill. So they have number, of different cattle programs like mine that come there. They kill for us. They develop custom cut sheets for our customers, and
Mm,
we pay them a fee. We do not own that part of the process, but every time we kill cattle, we have a meat scientist on staff who has a master's in meat scientist, and she's fantastic and could break down, you know, from how do you get this marbling, why, et cetera, down to, like, I mean, people have doctorates in
oh,
all
I'm
of these
sure.
areas that I'm
I'm
talking
sure
about,
of it.
and so I'm just hitting like the wave tops. And like I said, I do not have a doctorate in any of this stuff. I've just taken in the information in the way that I need but we hire experts.
I do have a
And
question
so,
though about this
yeah,
process real quick. So, for example, if a cattle ranch sends their food through Tyson, let's say, just we'll pull that out, then Tyson buys the meat and they're selling it themselves. But what I'm hearing you say is you have a processor that processes it and then sends it back to you for distribution. Is that the difference?
correct. There
Okay.
is. So Tyson would actually buy live fat
They
cattle,
just buy it all,
right?
right?
They come to my feed yard and they go, Greg, I need X amount of, we feed cattle for them. They get to a certain size, truck shows up, truck gets loaded, goes to their plant, gets processed, and then distributed through their distribution channels
Got it.
under, a variety of different brands, right? Our program is we retain ownership of our cattle all the way through. So once they're processed and labeled Little Belt Cattle Company, premium beef, they come back to me and we do our own distribution. So that includes our online partners. We work with a company called Crowd Cow, and we work with a veteran owned company that we're doing this kind of veteran uh, coalition program that we're running, which is called Casey Cattle Company, and they're a Wagyu based program, and we provide all their Angus for them right now. And those are our two online partners. We've got a couple markets and restaurants that we deliver to and distribute to here statewide in Montana. And so the big difference there is our cattle we own, we retain ownership, processed, cut, labeled Little Belt, come back to me, I do distribution. Tyson buys fat cattle from a number of different places,
Sure.
right? They process, they cut, package, distribute. Nothing wrong. It's just they're on they're killing thousands of cattle a day, and we're killing, a truckload every other week, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the scale and volume is just so
Yeah.
different. And that's why we're able to have the traceability that we are, but you eventually get to this like size and scale to where it's just not feasible to have like that that much acreage, that many cattle, that's why it's such a phase line business. And I tell people all the time, right? Like coming out of the military background that I did, they look all the time. How do you get more special forces, SEALs? How do you get that type of soldier? They always want to know, how can we get more of those guys quicker? Right. But if you
Yeah.
rush to the quantity, you typically sacrifice in the quality. And I think about that a lot as we've built, grown, and scale our beef in our cattle program is, you know, you have to be very careful how you grow in quantity and don't sacrifice in quality.
I'm sure of
And so
it.
we say to people all the time, like we have a customer right now and they're like, we'd like to double the POs that we're doing. Like our demand for our product is very high and our supply is like where we projected it to be, but we didn't anticipate
Anticipate. Yeah.
which is you
That's a
just
good
don't know,
problem to
right?
have.
It's a great problem to have, but it's a slow problem to fix because you have to start then looking at into next year. So we have to say to to a lot of our
2 years
partners,
down the road.
yeah, we go, hey, we can do this, but we can't do it till now, right? And
Right.
we can show them on a calendar like this is when these cattle will be at this size. We can keep more of our cattle in the system, and we can allocate those cattle to you. But very different than like a box beef program. Our live cattle are almost pre-allocated to the customers that they're going with, and we call it the meat puzzle. So there's a gal who's our director of operations who is a Air Force pilot, retired, and works for us. I mean, our business, one thing that we really are focused on is we're committed to hiring veterans and helping more veterans get into agriculture. When I got out of the Navy, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. Started kind of going down this path, never thinking that this was going to be something that was going to be available to me full time. A lot of times you hear like, if you didn't grow up doing this, there's no entry for you,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Of course.
And we, through doing it ourselves, my business partner Tim Sheehy and I, like we kind of, there was no blueprint for how to do it. We just started doing it, and we're trying to offer people now like, hey, this is actually how you can do it. Hey, if you want to go to school, here's programs, here's internships, here's nonprofits. And we hire a lot of veterans as part of our like in our mission vision statement. It states in there that we want to have a certain number of veterans as part of our company, because for me and Tim, we saw so many parallels in ag to the military. And although the skill sets are slightly different, kind of the mindset is very much the same. It's very much task driven, not time driven. And it's a ton of attention to detail. And what we've seen is veterans do very well. And so for an industry that has opportunity, and then a group of people that, a lot of who, in my opinion, have earned an opportunity, but also need an opportunity, it just pairs up really well. And so
Yeah.
we've tried to do a lot of that pairing. Um, so as we looked, as Allison looks at this is the number of cattle being processed, these are our customers and what cuts they need. We're allocating those full carcasses across a number of different distribution pipelines. And, so as you build, grow, and scale, what we found is we try to allocate beef to certain customers, not be selling anymore, right? There was a time though
Right.
where we would kill 5 head and I'd be out there knocking on doors
Trying to
going,
sell them.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and as we've built a reputation and been consistent in our quality, but also the size of our cuts, et cetera, we've now built like a very steady customer base that, that now we're just saying, how do we keep them full all the time? And then how do we build that over time? Because it's really easy to get, you see a lot of these programs out there and they have a handful of cattle, they get online, they sell those out, and then they're sold out for a certain amount of time, right? With our program, it's set up on a monthly basis to where we're processing a certain number of cattle every single month so that we're able not only to keep consistency and quality, but consistency in our supply chain, which is challenging to do because number one, you either like run out of cattle or your cattle are only allocated for a certain time frame because they're all born at the same time. And then how do you stretch that for a certain amount of beyond that? Let's say they're born in a 60-day window. How do you stretch that beyond, let's say, 90 days to make a
Yeah.
12-month supply chain? So we're always looking at like the size, it's this very interesting logistical puzzle where you say, I need cattle at this size today to be ready, for processing in March. And that's what I'm looking at right now is where are all of our cattle in that pipeline? What size are they now? Where are they going? And are they going to be ready at the time that I need them so that we don't have these lapses? And that's where these big guys, they're buying nationwide. So they have such big access and they have such big buying power that they're buying nationwide. But what they
For
don't
year-round
have
supply. Yeah.
exactly, but what they don't have is traceability then back to where those cattle like came
How
from.
could you?
There might be
Yeah.
programs that say like, oh, they're all natural, they're hormone free, etc., which is all great, and they do verify that. But if you said, what state did that animal even start in? They have no way of knowing, right? And even people that
Mm.
are buying regional cattle and putting them on feed and putting them into a program, or putting them on grass and then putting them on feed, some of those people know where those cattle are coming from, but a lot of them don't, right? And I think a big thing for us is the traceability that we have and have intentionally built into our program. We can look at a pen of steers and say, this is exactly where those came from,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And that allows me then to correct course or continue course based on the performance of those animals, specifically as it applies to the beef program.
Well, Greg, this has been really interesting. I didn't know how deep we would get into some of this stuff, but now I'm kind of fascinated. It's almost like a primer on cattle ranching, which I really appreciate. I hope the guys are
Yeah.
interested in it because it's a big part of our life. Like we eat this stuff every day. I think we ought to know a little bit about how the production and supply works. Why don't you let the guys know where to connect with you, learn a little bit more about your organization, and how they can figure it out.
Yeah, you bet. So Little Belt Cattle Company is our company. Business partner, fellow Navy SEAL, currently running for Senate in Montana, Tim Sheehy, and I started it in 2020. You can find us at www.littlebeltcattleco.com. You can find us on Instagram at Little Belt Cattle Co. We try to give everybody kind of a realistic look from the ranching side to the feeding cattle side to the processing to the distribution. Kind of our messaging there was, what does it take to build a cattle and beef company from the grass up? And we try to give people a realistic look. You know, Sometimes we look cool, sometimes we don't. But we try to let people know. Kind of, a lot of people are interested in, and just again, if you didn't grow up doing it, and I was in that category, it's just you just don't know that much about it. And I'll put this out there: if people are interested more in it, it's a super deep topic. I'm happy to come back on if people find it interesting or have further questions they want to know more about. But what I'd leave people with is there's fantastic opportunities right now to support local and U.S. beef producers. There's a number of ways to do that online. There's a number of ways to do that through farmers markets, through wherever you live. There's small and mid-sized producers out there that are making great products that fit whatever your buying preference is. If that's grass-fed, grass-finished, great. Find a local person that does that. If it's grass-fed, grain-finished, find somebody that you trust and you can verify what you're getting. But it's become so easy and so accessible that I would encourage everybody to, to look into that further. And I think the connection and the point of pride that you'll have as you learn more about who and where that comes from and what it truly takes to put great nutrient dense, high quality protein on, the plates of Americans, is easier and easier to do. We certainly appreciate if you like what we're doing and support us. You can find us at CrowdCow, as well as Casey Cattle Company. And those are both online distributions. If you're in Montana, we're in a bunch of restaurants and markets in Bozeman and Big Sky, and then throughout the state. But yeah, I apologize to you because some of these, they're never like yes or no answers, and
Oh
they're
no, it's
just they
good.
go really
Yeah, it's good.
deep. But if people have more questions, they can ping us on any of those places. They can shoot us an email. We love talking about how we do, what we do and why we think it's important. And I will leave you with this. agriculture in America as a foundation. I tell people all the time, the military provides national security and agriculture provides food security. Well, food security is national security. And one of the huge positive impacts, of being a US citizen is the access that we have to high quality, nutrient dense food. And that system is critical to like the future success of this country. And as you see acres coming out of the system, as you see producers coming out of the system, we have to protect that system because it is a critical system that we all rely upon. And the people that do that on a day in, day out basis provide, it's such a massive, necessary product that I think we've all got a little bit complacent to, myself included. And as you see what it takes to do that in the input cost and just the time and the effort and the care that producers put in both on the ag side and on, the ranching livestock production side. But I encourage everybody to support US producers because it does support this country and it supports critical, infrastructure and the defense of this country. So I'll leave you with that.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, we'll sync everything up so the guys know where to go. I didn't know Tim. Well, I don't know Tim, but I only saw a clip of him because you said his name, and I saw a clip where he said, Tim, Sheehy, those are also my pronouns or something like that. I caught that. So I didn't put that together
Yeah.
until you just said that. So very cool.
Yeah, he loves that's his one of his go-to jokes. But yeah, he spoke at the Republican National Convention.
National Convention.
And I'll just
Yeah.
say, like, we don't care what side of the aisle people are on. But that's something that, that Tim's passionate about. And, it's really interesting. And folks that live in Montana have seen this, the negative attacks that we've gotten as a first generation, veteran owned and operated startup ranch. It's been really interesting because they've, attacked him personally. They've attacked our business. And in part of that, it's to try to, basically make fun of us because we're new. And here we are trying our best to keep ag acres in ag, hire veterans, rural entrepreneurs, all the things that, in this state, the person that Tim's running against claims that he stands for. And then they come out and attack us on a regular basis, attacked him personally. And it really shows just that system as a whole. But
Horrible.
yeah, it is. But he's doing a great job. He cares about this country. I told Tim, as a buddy, I don't think you should do it. And as an American, I sure hope you do. And I'm really proud of him. I'm proud of the way that he's standing up to that. I'm proud of our business. I'm proud of what we stand for. And like I said, we stand for America. We stand for the American dream. We don't care what side of the aisle you're on, but you can't say that you stand for the American dream and then say that, certain places are closed off to certain people, right? I believe in, Americans can do anything, anywhere, from any background. And I fall into that in agriculture. This is something I was passionate about. I put the time and the effort, and Tim and I worked really hard at to get knowledgeable and to build our skill set and to build our business. And, ultimately to say that our business somehow, isn't as legitimate as somebody else because it wasn't a multi-generational thing that was passed down or that we were born into, basically is saying that the American dream, according to them, is not alive and well. And both Tim and I, military veterans, fought for this country and then came back, are proof that the American dream is alive and well. And I don't care what it is that you want to do. Don't ever let anybody tell you it's not for you. If you work hard at something, you get good at it, you have the right attitude. I mean, when I went into SEAL teams, the number of people that were not Navy SEALs that told me that'll never work, you're never going to make it, everybody quits, it's a lot of that comes from the fact that they never did it themselves, right? When we said we were going to start doing this, we got the same. More people probably told us that this was a bad idea than, becoming Navy SEALs. And that attitude has to change because we need more good people coming into all these industries. We need great Americans, starting businesses. And that is the backbone of this. And I said I would leave you with buy local and buy from Americans, but I'll leave you with this. Don't ever let anybody deter you from doing those things you want to do, because that is part. I don't care where you're from, what you want to do, what your background is. If you work hard at it, it's available out there. And the fact that that's the messaging that they're putting out and coming at basically at us with is something that, I just think says a lot about the state of of how they want things to be. And unfortunately, there's good people out there that aren't going to let that happen. And I hope that we're a good example of folks that are trying their best. Josh Smith's a great example. All these guys that are starting companies, they're doing it from the ground up. They're working super hard, and they're showing that it's possible.
Well, I love the message, brother. Happy to support you, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks a lot. Greatly appreciate it.